Sometimes the most terrifying moments of our existence are born from the simplest desires. Marcus Thompson woke up that morning with a single wish: to be normal. Just for a few hours. Just long enough to remember what it was like to be human before the curse consumed every shred of his sanity. The Millbrook shopping center was the kind of place that promised anonymity. Endless aisles filled with unfamiliar faces, the constant hum of overlapping conversations, the artificial aroma of processed food and cheap perfumes. Marcus believed he could blend in there, disappear into the crowds like just another shopper seeking some worldly pleasure. He didn't know he was about to discover that monsters can't hide from themselves. Tension was already building in his temples as he walked through the automatic doors. The smell. God, the smell of hundreds of people sweating, breathing, living hit his nostrils with an intensity that made his stomach churn. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, trying to control the wave of nausea that always preceded these episodes. He'd taken his medication that morning, meditated for an hour, done everything the doctors recommended to keep the beast asleep. But the beast never sleeps completely. Walking down the main aisle, Marcus watched the families pass by him. Parents pushing strollers, teenagers laughing too loudly, couples holding hands arguing over which store to visit first. All this normality made him feel like an imposter, like someone pretending to belong in a world that was no longer his. Every forced smile, every polite greeting he murmured to salespeople, every attempt to act like a normal person only intensified the feeling that something terrible was growing inside him. The food court was a mistake. Marcus realized it the moment he stepped foot inside. The noise there was deafening, a cacophony of voices, laughter, clanging dishes, and machines running. But it wasn't the sound that bothered him. It was the smell of meat being prepared. Grilled burgers, fried chicken, bacon sizzling in hot oil. The aroma hit his nervous system like a punch, awakening a hunger he knew wasn't human. Marcus walked up to the counter of a random diner, trying to keep his hands steady as he ordered a simple sandwich. The attendant, a young woman in her 20s with pink hair and a nose ring, smiled at him genuinely. She didn't know she was serving a predator. He didn't know the man in front of him lay awake at night, afraid to fall asleep and wake up covered in blood he couldn't explain. As he waited for his order, Marcus felt the muscles in his back begin to tense. That was how it always started. A subtle tension that spread down his spine, then down his arms, as if his bones were being pulled taut by invisible strings. He took a deep breath, trying to apply the relaxation techniques he'd learned from the psychiatrist. He counted to 10, then to 20, but the sensation only intensified. Worst of all, he could smell the people around him. Not just perfume or deodorant, but something more primal. The smell of skin, sweat, fear. Yes, there was fear there. A woman at the next table was nervous about something, her anxiety creating an acrid aroma that made the hairs on Marcus's arms stand on end. A man a few feet away was angry, arguing on the phone, and his anger had a metallic smell that made Marcus's mouth water in a way that terrified him. When Marcus finally received his sandwich, his hands were shaking in a way he hoped no one would notice. He found a secluded table in the corner of the food court, away from the noisy families and groups of teenagers. But the isolation didn't bring the relief he'd hoped. In fact, it only heightened his awareness of every sound, every movement, every heartbeat of the people around him. The first bite of the sandwich was like awakening something dormant deep within him. The undercooked meat left a metallic taste on his tongue, and for a terrifying moment, Marcus imagined what it would be like to bite into something that was still alive, that could still scream. He dropped the sandwich immediately, his hands flying to cover his mouth, trying to stifle the wave of nausea that rose in his throat. The people around him continued their mundane conversations, oblivious to the fact that a predator sat among them, fighting instincts that grew stronger by the second. Marcus watched a mother cutting food for her young daughter, her movements delicate and careful. The child, no more than 5 years old, giggled as she swung her legs in the high chair. The sound of laughter should have been comforting, but to Marcus, it sounded fragile, something that could easily be broken. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the images that were beginning to form in his mind. Images of claws ripping, of fangs sinking, of screams echoing through the mall corridors. These weren't fantasies he consciously created. They were fragmented memories of nights he'd rather forget. Nights when he'd wake up naked in distant forests, with the taste of blood in his mouth and terror in his heart. The transformation wasn't just physical. Marcus had learned that the hard way. It was mental, emotional, spiritual. It was as if another consciousness inhabited the same body, a primal consciousness that saw the world through the lenses of predator and prey. And this consciousness was awakening, stretching, testing the limits of its prison of human flesh. A group of college students sat at the next table, their loud voices and carefree laughter cutting through Marcus's attempts to remain calm. They talked about parties, relationships, and problems that seemed trivial compared to the horror Marcus faced every day. One of the boys, a blonde young man in a football jersey, gesticulated animatedly as he told a joke. His movements were wide, relaxed, confident. He was unaware he was being watched by eyes that were beginning to see less humanity and more vulnerability with each passing second. Marcus forced himself to look away, but his acute hearing caught every word, every breath, every rapid heartbeat, as one of the boys laughed too loudly. The sound of their blood rushing through their veins was like a somber symphony that made his own muscles tense with anticipation. He clenched his fists under the table, his nails, which seemed to have grown imperceptibly, digging into his palms until he felt warm drops of his own blood. The physical pain was welcome. It was real, human, something that connected him to who he used to be. Marcus focused on it, used it as an anchor to stay present, to remind himself that there was still a choice, that he could still fight, that he could still be more than the monster growing inside him like a malignant tumor. But then something happened that shattered all his carefully constructed defenses. The college girl at the next table knocked over her soda, and the dark liquid spilled across the table, dripping to the floor in steady drops. The sound of those drops hit Marcus like a physical blow. It wasn't just soda he heard falling. It was blood. Thick, warm, vital, and his body responded in a way that terrified him. Marcus felt his canines begin to elongate, pressing against his lower lip with a sharp pain that made him groan softly. He covered his mouth with his hand, pretending to cough as he fought the transformation taking place cell by cell within his body. His bones began to crack softly, a sound only he could hear, like dry twigs snapping in a silent forest. Panic set in when Marcus realized he could no longer get up from his chair. Not because he was weak, but because he was afraid of what he might do if he stood. His muscles were bulging beneath his shirt, stretching the fabric in a way that would soon be impossible to disguise. He could feel hair sprouting in places where hair had never grown before, an unbearable itch that spread across his arms and chest like a creeping fire. The girl who had spilled the soda bent down to clean up the mess, and as she leaned over, Marcus caught the scent of the carotid artery pulsing in her neck. The scent of blood rushing so close to the surface of her skin made his mouth fill with thick, viscous saliva. He swallowed hard, the raspy sound in his throat sounding more like a growl than a human act. The other young people at the table laughed at the situation, one of them joking with her friend about being clumsy. Their laughter was high-pitched, piercing, and each laugh hit Marcus like needles jabbing into his sensitized eardrums. He wanted them to stop. He needed them to stop. The human part of his conscience screamed silently at him to maintain control, but a more primal voice whispered that it would be just as easy to shut them up forever. Marcus looked at his own hands and saw that his nails had visibly grown, becoming thicker and sharper. They weren't yet full claws, but they were on their way. He hid them under the table, crossing his fingers to try to stop the growth, but he knew it was futile. Once the process began, it only ended in two ways, with complete transformation or with his death. The mall around him became a maze of temptations and terrors. Every passerby was a potential feast. Every child running through the aisles was easy prey, awakening hunting instincts Marcus hadn't known he possessed until the curse came upon him. He watched a group of teenagers walk away toward the stores, their laughter echoing through the aisles, and had to hold on to his chair to keep from getting up and following. The mall's air conditioning circulated the scents of everyone present, creating an olfactory symphony that was driving Marcus wild. He could distinguish each woman's perfume, each man's aftershave, the sweet, innocent smell of children. But more than that, he could sense their emotions through the scents their bodies released. Fear, anger, excitement, sadness. Everything blended into an aromatic cloud that fed the beast within him. A family approached the table next to his, the parents quietly discussing budgets while the teenage daughter rolled her eyes and fiddled with her phone. Marcus watched the family dynamic with a mixture of nostalgia and hunger. He vaguely remembered having a family like this before the curse. Before it became something that could no longer sit at the dinner table without considering family members as potential food. The girl glanced in his direction for a moment, and Marcus realized too late that her eyes had changed. Where once were normal brown irises, they now glowed an unearthly gold that reflected the mall's artificial light unsettlingly. The girl frowned, clearly troubled by something she couldn't quite place, and whispered something to her mother, who glanced briefly in Marcus's direction before rushing the family away. Marcus knew he had mere minutes before his appearance became impossible to disguise. His teeth now pressed against his closed lips, and he could feel the shape of his face beginning to subtly alter. His jaws were expanding, preparing to accommodate still growing fangs. Marcus forced himself out of his chair, his movement stiff and calculated, like someone trying to hide a serious injury. Each step toward the food court exit felt like an eternity, his muscles protesting the effort of maintaining a human appearance. He kept his head down, avoiding eye contact, but he could feel curious eyes following him as he walked. The mall's main corridor stretched out before him like an endless tunnel of temptation. The bright store windows seemed to mock his condition, displaying smiling mannequins wearing clothes he could never wear again without the risk of ripping them during a makeover. Marcus tried to quicken his pace, but his feet felt like they had grown inside his shoes, squeezing painfully with every movement. A wave of heat swept through his body, making him sweat profusely. His shirt began to stick to his back, and Marcus could feel the fabric stretching dangerously as his muscles continued to expand. He stopped in front of a clothing store, pretending to look in the window as he tried to regain control, but his reflection in the glass terrified him. His golden eyes glowed like those of a nocturnal animal, and his posture had subtly changed, becoming more predatory, more alert. Two elderly women passed him, chatting about their grandchildren, and Marcus had to clench his fists until his nails, now definitely claws in the making, dipped into his palms to keep from turning and following the scent of vulnerability emanating from them. The logical part of his mind screamed that they were just two grandmothers shopping, but the beast saw only easy prey, slow, isolated from the rest of the herd. The noise of the mall was becoming unbearable. Every conversation, every laugh, every sound of bags swaying amplified in his sensitized ears until it became a painful cacophony. Marcus pressed his hands against his ears, trying to muffle the sound, but only managed to intensify his awareness of his own racing heartbeat and labored breathing. He needed to get to the bathroom. It was his only chance to lock himself somewhere private where he could try to control the transformation away from prying eyes. Marcus spotted the directional signs and began walking purposefully toward the restrooms. But each step was a struggle against instincts that urged him in the opposite direction, toward the crowds of unsuspecting people. Along the way, Marcus passed a toy store where children were playing with interactive displays. Their high-pitched laughter pierced his concentration like blades, and for a terrifying moment, he imagined how easy it would be to silence those sounds forever. The image was so vivid and disturbing that Marcus had to lean against the wall, fighting a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with physical illness and everything to do with moral horror. A mother noticed his strange behavior and instinctively pulled her young daughter closer, her maternal instincts detecting danger even without understanding its nature. The child looked at Marcus with wide, curious eyes, and he saw his own reflection in those innocent pupils, a man transforming into something monstrous, something that should not exist in the civilized world. The scent of people was growing more intense, more enticing. Marcus could distinguish blood types by their scent, could sense who was scared, who was sick, who would be the easiest prey. This information came to him without his asking, filling his mind with knowledge he didn't want to possess. It was as if his senses were being tuned to a predator's frequency that made it impossible to see people as anything other than potential food. Finally, Marcus spotted the entrance to the men's room. It was the longest 20 meters of his life. With each step, he felt his bones realigning, his spine curving in a way that would soon become irreversible. His hands, now clearly non-human to anyone who looked closely, trembled as he struggled to keep his arms close to his body. Marcus pushed the bathroom door open harder than he intended, the metal groaning under the pressure of his hands, which were no longer entirely human. The room was partially empty, only the sound of a dripping faucet echoing off the cold tile walls. He hurried to the last stall, locking himself inside with fingers that trembled so badly he could barely turn the lock. Alone at last, Marcus allowed the mask of humanity to slip for a few seconds. His breath came in short, labored bursts, more like the gasps of a wounded animal than the breathing patterns of a man. He looked down and saw that his shirt was completely soaked with sweat, the fabric stretched taut over muscles that continued to grow and reshape. His hands were the most terrifying. His fingers had elongated, the joints swelling in a way that made every movement seem clumsy and predatory. His nails, now definitely claws, had ripped small holes in his palms where he had dug them in, trying to maintain control. The blood that flowed was darker than it should have been, almost black in the dim fluorescent light of the bathroom. Marcus tried to concentrate on the breathing techniques he'd learned, but each breath brought with it the intensified smell of the room. Disinfectant, urine, the residual fear of hundreds of people who had used this space. Worse still, he could smell the people in the mall beyond the door, their individual scents mingling into an aromatic soup that made his mouth water uncontrollably. The mirror above the sink reflected a stranger when Marcus finally found the courage to look. His face was subtly lengthening, his jaw expanding to accommodate visibly growing teeth. His golden eyes shone with a light of their own, and there was something fundamentally different in his expression. Where there had once been humanity, there was now only primal hunger and predatory instinct. Then he heard footsteps approaching. Marcus froze, all his heightened senses focused on the bathroom door. It was two men talking quietly about something work-related. Their voices echoed in the confined space, and Marcus could smell the cheap cologne and cigarette smoke wafting from them. More importantly, he could sense that they were relaxed, unprepared, vulnerable. The beast within Marcus growled in anticipation. Here was an opportunity. Two men isolated, away from the crowds, in a confined space where no one could interfere. The primal part of his consciousness began calculating angles of attack, points of vulnerability, the most efficient way to silence their voices before they could scream. Marcus bit his lip until it bled, using the pain to anchor himself in human reality. He wasn't a murderer. No matter what the curse was doing to his body, his mind was still his own. He could still choose. He could still resist the instinct screaming at him to feed, to satisfy the hunger growing like a black void at the center of his being. The men approached the sinks, their mundane conversations about sales quotas and boss issues sounding absurdly normal in contrast to the horror Marcus was experiencing. One of them laughed at something the other said, the sound echoing off the tiled walls, and Marcus had to press his hands to his ears to keep from being overcome by the temptation to make the sound stop. But then something happened that shattered all his resolve to maintain control. One of the men began washing his hands, and the scent of the soap mingled with his skin, creating an aromatic combination that awakened primal memories in Marcus's mind. Memories of night hunts, of prey stalking through dark forests, of warm blood trickling down his throat. Marcus felt his muscles contracting, preparing for the attack. His vision began to redden around the edges, a sign he had learned to recognize as the prelude to complete transformation. In a matter of minutes, perhaps seconds, nothing of Marcus Thompson's human consciousness would remain. Only the beast would remain, ravenous and out of control in a bathroom with two unsuspecting prey. Time shattered into crystallized fragments of horror. Marcus could hear every drop of water falling from the faucet like an explosion, every breath of the men outside the cabin like a whispered invitation. His shirt finally ripped, the fabric giving way to the pressure of his muscles continuing to expand. The sound was soft, barely audible, but to his hypersensitive ears it sounded like a cannon shot announcing the inevitable. His feet had grown so much that his shoes became instruments of torture, squeezing them unbearably. Marcus kicked them, the leather tearing easily under the force of his new claws. The relief was momentary, quickly replaced by the terror of realizing there was no turning back. He had crossed an invisible line from which there was no return. One of the men at the sink commented on the noise coming from the stall, his voice carrying a casual curiosity that would soon turn to pure terror. Marcus could smell their emotional shift, the subtle transition from disinterest to concern, and then to something more primal. Survival instinct. They knew, on some subconscious level, that something was terribly wrong. The transformation accelerated beyond control. Marcus felt his facial bones rearrange with audible cracks, his snout elongating as fully formed fangs pierced his gums. The taste of his own blood filled his mouth, metallic and hot, awakening a thirst he hadn't known existed. His vision shifted, colors intensifying as his perception adjusted to a nocturnal existence of hunting and predation. The men's voices grew higher, more urgent. One of them mentioned calling security, the other suggested they simply leave. Marcus could feel fear beginning to seep into their body odors, transforming them from a mere human presence into something far more tempting. Frightened prey always smelled better. Marcus looked down at his hands and saw fully developed claws, curved and razor-sharp. Dark hair sprouted along his forearms, and he could feel more growing on his chest and back. His breathing had changed, becoming deeper, more animalistic. Each exhalation came out as a low growl that echoed off the cabin walls. The final moment of choice came when one of the men approached the cabin door. Marcus could see the shadow of his feet through the crack below, could hear his nervous breathing, could feel the heat of his body just inches away. It would be so simple to break down the door, so easy to silence the screams before they even began. The beast within Marcus roared with hunger and anticipation, his predatory instincts taking over completely. Every fiber of his transformed being screamed for him to attack, to feed, to satisfy the primal hunger burning like acid in his veins. This was his nature now. This was his purpose. But somewhere, deep within the consciousness that still struggled to exist, Marcus Thompson's weak voice whispered a final plea. A desperate prayer that something human remained amidst the monster he had become. An impossible hope that he could hold out for a few more seconds, a few more minutes, maybe long enough for the men to leave and leave the bathroom safely. The man outside knocked on the cabin door, his voice echoing in the confined space as he asked if Marcus was okay. The sound was like a hammer hitting the skull of the creature Marcus had become. His muscles contracted, preparing to spring. His claws curled, ready to rip. His teeth bared in a predatory smile that was anything but human. And then, in the silence that followed, only the sound of the dripping faucet remained. Dripping, dripping, dripping. Like a metronome ticking away the final seconds before something terrible and irreversible happened at the Millbrook Mall. What happened next would forever remain buried in the shadows of that afternoon. Some truths are too heavy to be told in full.